we listen to the music of Carl Friedrich Abel, the chamber musician to Queen Charlotte of England, the wife of George III, we turn our attention to the post-Napoleonic world, one where the 19th century can accurately be said to have begun. The reemergence of religious devotion after the Revolution was matched only in intensity by the onslaught of industrialization in the cities of both Europe and North America. New forms of transportation and better technology would work major changes on the landscape and revolutionize the social dynamic, and not always for the better. With the religious revival came a period of introspection and examination that resulted in many repenting of their animosity toward religion, both during the Revolution and the Napoleonic period. The restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in France, though, also resulted in numerous church lands restored to them, and this engendered resentment and sowed the seeds of further unrest. Meanwhile, those great gadflies of the established order, the Jesuits, were reconstituted and allowed to begin their work, missionary and university-level work throughout Europe. However, the reestablishment of the church in Spain also brought back the extremely nasty Spanish Inquisition. And remember, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. However, the Roman Church did not go unopposed, as new Protestant societies like the Freemasons challenged the authority of the reestablished states. In Britain now there arose the great middle-class religion, the Methodists, begun by John Wesley and a traveling preacher named George Whitefield, who went about the 13 colonies and later the United States. The Methodists appealed to the merchants and laborers of society because of its egalitarian and democratic ideals, and even practiced a rudimentary sexual equality. And from the Methodist movement came things like Sunday schools. Meanwhile, over in the United States, the response to the sudden market revolution of American society and economy gave rise to a second Great Awakening from 1790 until 1830, where huge revivals led by charismatic preachers like Charles Grandison Finney now called upon the faithful to bring along the millennium through reform of society and systematic missionary work. Especially along the newly dug Erie Canal in upstate New York, a massive religious revival erupted as leaders, among whom was a young man born into poverty by the name of Joseph Smith, began to call upon earthly works to help bring about the coming of the millennium prior to the arrival of Christ. Yet again, though, a dark side began to appear, as the exclusivity of such religious movements caused skepticism and even anxiety, and missionary activity by both Catholics and Protestants now became the vanguard of a new imperialism. At the heart of the changes in society was industrialization. In Britain, northern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the Rhineland, which is the west bank of the Rhine River in Germany, industrialization began to change the landscape and the society at the same time. Now, what were the causes of industrialization in Europe? It begins really with the old monastic stress on order and time that later becomes known as the Protestant work ethic. Secondly, the first true product of mass industrialization was printing. With the printing presses now powered by steam technology, mass publication of books, newspapers, and periodicals grew exponentially. We're going to use that term a lot, exponentially, because there will be exponential growth throughout this period. The second thing that led to greater industrialization was the reduction in epidemics and an agricultural revolution that meant better nutrition, giving rise to the birth rate. And this meant more laborers. The expansion of international trade meant more markets for finished goods, giving rise to even more demands for industrialization. Finally, the transition from low heat, limited quantity organic fuels like wood to higher heat, higher quantity fossil fuels like coal and later oil meant longer periods of production and better production. Add to all of that a patent system that encouraged newer and better forms of technology, and industry soared. It was in Britain, though, that industrialization had its greatest growth. The early United States was still decades away in a major war from the mass industrialization that would make it a manufacturing giant of the late 19th century. Those like Thomas Jefferson still envisioned a great agrarian republic that could grow enough foodstuffs to barter for industrial-made products. Britain, on the other hand, took industrialization to heart almost as soon as Watt developed his steam engine. Why Britain, though, as opposed to other nations? For one, the end of the feudal system after the English Civil War gave rise to economic and geographic stability. Secondly, Britain is an island nation. Its relative isolation meant that it remained sheltered from the wars that had ravaged the nations of the continent. The Reformation had completely taken hold of Britain as well, and even its Catholic population tended to adhere to what was called the Protestant work ethic. The high concentration of population in Britain meant an available and relatively static workforce for industry, and massive amounts of coal, tin, and other mineral resources meant that Britain could draw upon its own resources rather than barter with other nations. Finally, the relatively cool, wet climate meant that Britain was ideally located for the second great product of mass industrialization, textiles. While much of Europe remained agrarian, the shift toward industrialization took place especially as aforementioned in Britain and parts of Northern Europe. Major innovations like the steam engine and water frame and then iron smelting now meant mass industrialization could speed up even further and have purer metals with which to work. And there was also, as mentioned, a steady, ready-made working class for the factories. Families of farmers looking for better opportunities than work on the land, demobilized soldiers already used to the regimented living demanded by factory work, displaced artisans who saw their crafts fade before mass industrialization, and the children of factory workers, that is, those individuals whose hands and even bodies were so small that they could fit into narrow and often dangerous places. These all began to fill the ranks of the working class. Despite the desire for more money and better opportunities, working conditions were brutal and grueling, and little attention was given by factory owners and managers to the safety and protection of workers. At times, conditions got so dire that individuals and groups calling themselves Luddites destroyed machines and burned mills in protest, and called for a return to the simple agrarian lifestyle of the country. Among those who later called themselves Luddites was a young writer and professor from South Africa who grew up in England. His name was J.R.R. Tolkien. The situation had become desperate in 1816, which was the year considered the one without a summer. This was because of abnormally low temperatures and a series of bread laws called the Corn Laws. Wheat in Europe was called corn, and this kept the price of bread high. Another economic slump in 1819, this was called a panic in the United States, led leaders to call for political reform and reduction in prices. They begin to put pressure on Parliament, still very much in the grip of Adam Smith-style ideology, still very much in the thrall of the owners and the landowning classes, to push aside the invisible hand of Adam Smith and address the issues. They called large open-air meetings, and there they called for parliamentary reform, such as universal suffrage for all males at least. On August 16, 1819, working-class people gathered at St. Peter's Field in Manchester. It was the largest ever political gathering of working-class people and called for universal suffrage. Only 11% of adult males at the time had the vote. This is very much similar to the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. In response, though, at this time, local leaders called upon a sort of militia cavalry to disperse the growing crowd. After they tried to ride in and disperse the crowd, a leading landowner named William Holton called for the regular army unit, the 15th Hussars, to come in and finish the job. They charged with sabers drawn, and contemporary accounts estimate that between 9 and 17 people were killed, and one of them was a veteran of the Battle of Waterloo, and another 400 to 700 injured in the ensuing confusion. Many of them were trampled. The event was first labeled the Peterloo Massacre by the radical newspaper, the Manchester Observer. It was a bitterly ironic reference to the bloody Battle of Waterloo, which had taken place only 4 years earlier. This event was the first public meeting at which journalists from important distant newspapers were present, and within a day or so of the event, accounts were published in London, Leeds, and Liverpool, fueling outrage throughout the region and the country. The immediate response to the massacre was typical of a Tory government. It cracked down on reform, arrested journalists, closed down the radical papers, and blamed the crowd, even though it was unarmed. The leaders of the meeting were tried for sedition and put in prison. The members of the cavalry who were on trial were all acquitted on the grounds of following orders in self-defense. History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The Prince of Wales, later King George IV, at the time acting as the regent for his dying father, thanked the soldiers for their acts, and this made him look like an even bigger fool than he was. It appeared the revolution may come again to England for the first time since 1688. Parliament responded with what was known as the Six Acts, designed to reinforce conservatism over revolution by banning unlawful drilling, allowing for the seizure of weapons, a misdemeanor act to the opportunities for bail, and allowing for a speedier court processing, banning the so-called seditious meetings, cracking down on free speech by enforcing libel laws, and increased taxes on newspapers. Yes, another version of the Stamp Act, and we all know how well that worked the first time. Now here is an artist's depiction of a factory city, and even though it is done in black and white with pencil and so forth, you get a sense already of the stark features of a factory city, especially the smoke. And here we see an artist's depiction of the poor and destitute in the town of St. Giles, and the artist spares no detail in depicting the dire plight of the poor and the destitute. The concentration of people in underdeveloped tenements and cities without developed public health facilities meant that sanitation and sewage were minimal, if at all, and that meant that diseases like cholera could run amok. The need to get goods to market and get materials to the factories mandated new and more efficient forms of transportation. Construction of roads allowed for easier travel, and infrastructure improvements also made travel easier. Among the great projects of the time were the canals that allowed flat barges and boats to carry more materials and finished goods. Workers were needed for these projects, digging such canals, and such projects even made their way over to the United States with the aforementioned Erie Canal, as well as a canal here in New Orleans called the New Basin Canal, dug in 1832. The site of it is now between where Pontchartrain Boulevard and West End Boulevard and the Pontchartrain Expressway are located. It went from the lake all the way back to the area behind the Superdome. The other form of mass transportation was directly tied to the new steam technology, railroads. Beginning with horse-drawn cars, rail transport became faster and more efficient with the introduction of steam power. Given the need for more coal and refined steel, the Industrial Revolution now grew again exponentially with the railroads. In addition to transporting cargo, railroads also transported people. Here one can see an early form of a railroad engine with cars, which were simply horse-drawn carriages with rail wheels in place of road wheels. Railroad and steamship transport was very dangerous at this time. There existed little to no safety regulations for the engines. This graph shows the growth of rail transport in Britain by 1830 and by 1850, respectively. Again, it was Britain's isolation and stability that led to such excellent and exponential railroad development. But as with all things, there is a dark side. Increased industrialization meant the increased use of coal and other fossil fuels, and that meant an increase in atmospheric pollution, resulting in lung diseases and diseases of the skin, and dare we mention even climate change. The pace of human labor was dictated by machines now. Boat and rail schedules also contributed to the pace of human work. And so the ruling master in factories was often the clock, when before it was workers who dictated the pace of work. Few, if any, safety regulations protected workers in hazardous jobs, and cities like London, Manchester, Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, Bristol, and Leeds experienced population booms, but without the necessary infrastructure to support it. And perhaps the worst of it all was child labor. Smaller hands and bodies made children indispensable because they had the ability to crawl into spaces inaccessible to adults. Despite the hazards and working as many hours and in similar conditions, children worked at a much lower pay. Child fatalities and amputations were common, and no child labor laws existed in Britain to protect children until the 1830s. In this photograph, we see a child, a young girl, tending a series of bobbins in a textile mill, and those bobbins are all spinning at very high speeds, and she has the unenviable task of putting her hands in there to check to make sure that everything is working properly. With child labor, there was often heartbreak and even tragedy. Here we see a young man showing the results of him putting his hands into the small spaces of machines and coming away missing a few fingers. Puck magazine was founded in 1876 in the United States, and it often took a critical view of world affairs. Often it satirized society and was famous for its political cartoons. Here it shows its disdain for child labor as the evil boss factory owner is whipping the children. Among the numerous critics of child labor was Carlos Lorenzini, who wrote under the pen name of Carlo Collodi. His great epic fantasy of 1881 in part lampooned the industrial age and its exploitation of children. The allegorical fantasy tale told of a marionette who wished to become a real boy, and the story was so popular that it was translated into 260 languages worldwide. Of course, we know it well because Walt Disney made it into a motion picture in 1940, The Adventures of Pinocchio. Now, this map shows the extent of the rail lines and various industries throughout Europe, as well as areas of natural resources. You get to see just how concentrated it is in Great Britain. Now, I'm not going to say exponential here, but it certainly shows on this graph as you see the growth of the cities in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. And among them, London was among those that had the greatest of all the growth. And finally, this map shows the growth of population in Europe and how it grew the greatest in the industrialized and most stable areas.